The story follows a cold-hearted real estate tycoon who once cast his pregnant wife out into the snowy night. 20 years later, the son he abandoned unexpectedly appears at the headquarters of his empire, carrying a name and a truth no one can deny. But will the past allow them one final chance? New York in winter had no snow, only wind gusts that whipped through the skyscrapers, slipping into every crevice of the city streets, icy and invisible, much like the feeling Olivia Crawford had grown accustomed to in her own home. On the 47th floor of a penthouse overlooking Central Park, the city's dazzling lights reflected off the massive glass window, where a man sat in quiet contemplation in a leather armchair, a glass of whiskey swirling in his hand. James Crawford, real estate mogul, the man whose name graced entire streets, was the epitome of success that millions admired. But to Olivia, he was little more than a shadow, cold, distant, and untouchable. She stood by the fireplace, her fingers twisting the hem of her thin wool dress. Her high heels had long been discarded. The only thing still grounding her was the faint warmth from the flickering flames. For 3 days, she had been searching for a moment of peace to share the most important news of her life. But in this house, peace was a luxury she couldn't afford. James glanced over his shoulder, his gaze skimming her lightly, as though her presence was just a vague detail in the lavish portrait of his life. "Something wrong?" His voice was low and flat, like the smoke rising from his drink. Olivia took a deep breath. I have something to tell you," she whispered, her voice trembling not from the cold. James turned his head, his deep blue eyes sharp with calculation, glinting under the golden lamplight. He gave a slight nod, not bothering to set down his glass. "Then say it." I'm pregnant," Olivia said, each word escaping like it had been trapped in a chokehold. A silence fell over the room. No glass shattered, no gasp of shock or joy, just the clink of ice against the tumbler and a stillness that slowly drained the air. James set his drink on the glass table and turned fully to face her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes cut like a blade. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his lips curling into a lopsided smirk. "And you think that's something I should be happy about?" Olivia froze. "James, it's our child." "Our child." He let out a laugh, a sound as cold as metal. "Olivia, I'm a man, not stupid enough to miss this classic ploy." "What ploy?" Her eyes widened, bewildered. James stood, his shadow stretching long across the polished marble floor. "You think I don't know? My mother warned me. You're just a small-town girl who stepped into this world for money, and now you're pregnant to tie me down with a belly." Olivia went numb. I love you. It was never about money." "Love?" James leaned closer, his gaze sliding over her face like he was appraising something that had just lost its value. "What kind of love is always so convenient, always knows how to turn itself into financial leverage?" Olivia couldn't speak. She had once loved this man with every fiber of her being, had believed that beneath his icy exterior was a heart waiting to be warmed, but now she saw only a stranger, calculating and cruel. She took a step back, trembling not just from fear, but from the shattering inside her. "James, this is your child, your flesh and blood." He didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out his wallet and retrieved a checkbook. Sitting back down, he scribbled a few numbers, tore off the check, and handed it to her. "Take it. This is enough for you to live comfortably for a while. Don't ever show up in front of me again." Olivia stared at the check as if it were a death certificate for a dream that had once been beautiful. A dream of family, of a child growing up surrounded by love. All of it had just been smashed to pieces by a few cold digits. She took the check, but didn't pocket it. She looked into his eyes one last time, searching for the husband who had once been tender, who had called her the light in a house too big, but all she saw was emptiness, an emptiness mirrored by the city outside, brilliant, bustling, and utterly indifferent. The check fell to the floor like a cold slap in the room that had once been a home. Olivia didn't pick it up. She stood there, her eyes dry, unable to shed another tear. Some pains don't erupt into sobs. They simply fracture silently within the heart. James remained seated in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, as if he'd just concluded a simple negotiation. To him, it was all just a transaction. "You should leave before I call security," he said evenly, his voice devoid of any trace of emotion, from a man who had shared the bed with her for 3 years. Olivia turned away. Her trembling hand dragged a small suitcase from the corner of the room, the same suitcase she'd brought into this apartment 3 years ago with a trusting smile and the excitement of starting a new life. Now it accompanied her again, but this time it was an escape. The penthouse door closed behind her with a sharp click, severing her last thread of hope. The long hallway, bathed in gleaming golden light, stretched endlessly before her. The elevator descent from the 47th floor poured seconds of stillness into her soul. When she stepped outside, the winter wind lashed her face like a whip, snapping her awake. No one looked at her. A woman in a thin dress, pulling a suitcase, walking along the brightly lit avenue in the dead of night. The city kept spinning, cars sped by, signs blinked vibrantly. Only she stood amid the bustle, feeling invisible. She forced herself to take one step after another, clinging to the sidewalk like someone trying to crawl out of an abyss. Her phone had died that afternoon, and with a few coins left in her wallet, a taxi was an unaffordable luxury. But who would she call? She had no family in New York. Her family, if it could still be called that, was in Chicago, a place she'd left behind with the hope of proving she'd chosen the right man. She'd been wrong. A stronger gust of wind slapped her face, jolting her from her thoughts. Instinctively, she wrapped her arms around her stomach, protecting the tiny life growing inside her. "We'll be okay, I promise," she whispered, her voice catch. After nearly an hour of wandering, her numb feet stopped in front of Grand Central Station. She dragged her suitcase into the concourse where thousands of people rushed toward their destinations while she had no idea where she was going. An empty bench in a quiet corner. She sat down, her aching back pressing against the cold wooden frame. Her arms encircled her belly, as if searching for a heartbeat to hold on to, refusing to cry, refusing to panic, refusing to collapse. But she was so tired. Around her, people laughed, talked on phones, brushed past each other like streams of fate. No one stopped, no one noticed a woman silently sinking to the depths of her life on a night so cold it chilled the bones. She looked up at the flickering electronic board listing cities: Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and then her eyes caught a familiar line. Chicago, 7:15 a.m., Platform 12. Chicago. The name stirred memories she thought had long faded. A small apartment with her mother, college dorms, her old friend Rachel, who had cried when she left the city for a marriage everyone but Olivia knew was doomed. She bit her lip. It could be an escape, or one last desperate gamble. Olivia stood and walked toward the ticket counter. She waited her turn, her hand gripping her wallet strap like it was a fragile lifeline. When her turn came, she asked in a hoarse voice, "One ticket to Chicago, one way?" The ticket agent tapped the keyboard. $120. Olivia froze. She opened her wallet. Crumpled bills, a locked bank card from the moment she left the penthouse. Less than $40. Too little. Too empty. Her chest tightened. Standing amid the crowded ticket counter, she realized she had nothing left to lose, except herself. But at that moment, low in her belly, she felt a faint stir. A gentle kick. No one saw that moment. A mother, abandoned, standing in the greatest city in the world, carrying an unborn child, and making the biggest decision of her life. Olivia turned and stepped back into the cold night, but this time in her heart there was more than just despair. There was an unspoken promise. She would not collapse. For her child, the long bus ride from New York to Chicago carried nothing but a small suitcase in Olivia's battered heart. For over 10 hours, crossing frigid states, she sat silently by the window, her hand pressed against her belly, feeling the faint stirrings of her child. the only thing keeping her survival instinct alive. Chicago emerged at dawn, wrapped in the damp chill of January. It lacked New York's glamour, but here, the old buildings, misty streets, and slower pace of life made it easier for her to breathe. No more mirrored glass reflecting an impassive face. No more memories trampled by abandonment. Chicago was a place of old memories, and one name she wasn't sure she could still call upon. Rachel. Olivia hadn't spoken to Rachel in over 2 years. Life, work, and the marriage she'd once thought was the right answer had gradually frayed the threads of their old friendship. But now, in this unfamiliar city, Rachel's name was the only one that flickered in her mind like a fragile streak of light. A carefully folded, worn-edged piece of paper, the address from an old Christmas card, was all she had kept. Olivia arrived at the door of a weathered 3-story building in Lincoln Park. She stood hesitating under the awning for a long time, her hands trembling not just from the cold wind but from a deep-seated fear. What if Rachel wasn't here anymore? What if she'd forgotten her? What if this was just a delusional hope? She took a deep breath and raised her hand, tapping lightly 3 times on the faded blue door. No response. Olivia gripped her suitcase handle tighter, preparing to turn away when the door creaked open. Warm light spilled out from inside like a silent embrace. The woman in the doorway took a moment to register what she saw. "Olivia?" Rachel's voice caught, as if a long-forgotten memory had just stepped out of the past. Olivia burst into tears. She couldn't manage a word, only nodding as tears streamed uncontrollably down her face. She looked awful, tangled hair, a thin coat, muddy shoes, a pale face, and hollow eyes like someone who'd lost everything. Rachel didn't ask questions. She stepped forward and wrapped Olivia in a tight hug, as if afraid her friend might dissolve if she let go. "Come in," Rachel whispered. "You're freezing." Rachel's small apartment wasn't luxurious, but it radiated an unbelievable warmth. The old wooden floor creaked under each step. The scent of coffee filled the air, and photos of Rachel with her students lined the hallway. This place felt more like home than anywhere Olivia had lived in the past 3 years. She sank into a sofa draped with a quilted blanket. Rachel handed her a mug of hot tea, saying nothing at first. She waited, and then, under the soft glow of a lamp beside the steaming tea, Olivia began to speak, in a flat, steady voice, as if recounting her life through someone else's eyes. She told Rachel about James, about the whiskey glass, the check, the door slamming shut behind her. She spoke of wandering through New York at night, of Grand Central Station, of the stranger who'd given her $120 with the words, "Pay it forward when you can." And then she talked about the baby, about the first faint kick in the cold night. Rachel listened silently throughout the story, but her eyes held a storm, anger, pity, and an unnamed ache. "It's not your fault," Rachel said at last, her voice trembling with emotion. "The fault is his. It's that world you believed in. But you're here now. You survived." Olivia lowered her head, her hand resting on her belly. "I don't know where to start over. No job, no home. I can't raise a child like this." Rachel took her hand and squeezed it firmly. "You won't have to do it alone. Here, you have me. You have a home, a place to sleep, and little by little we'll figure it out, okay?" Olivia broke down again, but this time it wasn't from despair. It was from something small igniting inside her. Hope. She had nothing left, but she had Rachel. She had a home, however modest, ready to welcome her. She had a friend, however distant before, willing to catch her when the world had turned its back. And so, from what seemed like an ending, her journey of rebirth began. Not dazzling, not loud, but real. The first morning waking up in Rachel's small apartment, Olivia heard the wind tapping against the window and the faint smell of weak coffee seeping through the door crack. Winter sunlight streamed through the thin blanket, making the room feel far warmer than it actually was. But inside her, a chill lingered like an unshakable ghost. She opened her eyes, slowly sitting up, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. The baby was still quiet, as if it were listening, waiting to see what this mother would do next. "Where do we start?" Olivia whispered, her gaze fixed on the cracked ceiling, lines running across it like her own life, warped, uneven, but not yet broken. The first day of job hunting. Olivia stood in front of the mirror, tucking an old dress shirt into a thick sweater to hide the frayed hem and a small tear near the cuff. She didn't have many office dress she owned, no longer fit, as her body began to change with pregnancy. Still, the eyes staring back at her in the mirror weren't dim. They carried the hue of determination. With a stack of resumes printed at the public library and a trembling courage, Olivia stepped out into the busy Chicago streets, blending into the flow of hurried people. Every small cafe, bookstore, and convenience store became a stop. She asked, smiled, handed over her resume, and always heard the same refrain. "We need someone with experience. We're not hiring right now. Leave your resume. We'll call if something comes up." She nodded her thanks each time, though her heart shrank as if pricked by tiny needles. By mid-afternoon, her feet were numb, and she clutched a cup of water from a fast food joint as if it were lunch. At a small family diner on River North, she spotted a sign in the window, "Help Wanted Morning Shift." She stepped inside, the door chime jingling. A silver-haired woman with a neatly tied bun, wearing an apron and a weathered expression, looked up from the counter. Margaret, the owner. "Can I help you?" Her voice was curt, tired. Olivia swallowed hard. I saw the hiring sign. I'd like to apply." Margaret sized her up from head to toe. "Ever worked in a restaurant?" "No," Olivia answered honestly, "but I learn fast. I can wash dishes, wipe tables, clean anything you need." Margaret frowned. "Customers here are picky. The work's hard. No room for weaklings." Olivia gripped her bag tighter. "I'm not weak. I just need a chance." A beat of silence. Then Margaret tossed her an old green apron. "Tomorrow, 6 a.m. 1 minute late and you're out." Olivia nodded. For the first time in weeks, a small smile flickered across her face. The first day of work. She arrived 15 minutes early. Her feet ached from walking through snow the night before, but her eyes still shone. She wiped tables, learned to use the coffee machine, memorized orders. By noon, her hands were raw from dishwater. Her back throbbed from bending too much, and her head pounded like a hammer. But when a customer returned the bill with a thanks, the coffee was great. Something sparked inside her, like a sliver of light piercing a dusty room. That evening, back at Rachel's, she collapsed onto the chair like an empty sack. But when Rachel handed her a plate of hot pasta, Olivia looked up, eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't get fired. I actually did it." Rachel smiled, touching her hand lightly. "See, you're starting already. 1 week, then 2. Olivia grew accustomed to the rhythm of work. She skipped lunch, saving every meager dollar of her paycheck. At night, after washing dishes, she scoured the internet for medical transcription courses, a field she'd once abandoned. A few nonprofits aiding single mothers popped up. She jotted down every detail. Though exhaustion sent her dozing off at the table, her heart had learned what hope felt like. One night, as she folded up a course flyer and prepared for bed, she felt a faint movement in her belly. She placed her hand there. A kick, the first clear one. She smiled, a smile so soft it was almost soundless, but her eyes sparkled. "Hi, little one," she whispered. "Mom's doing it for you." Spring arrived late in Chicago. Snow still clung thickly to the edges of narrow streets, and the wind whistled through window panes each morning. But in Rachel's second-floor apartment, something was growing. Quietly, steadily, and unstoppable, Olivia braced herself against the sink, sweat beading on her forehead despite the frigid kitchen. The pains had begun at midnight, growing sharper and more relentless, as if her body were screaming to release something sacred that had been held too long. Rachel burst into the room when she heard the loud clatter of a spoon hitting the floor. She didn't ask questions, just called an ambulance, her hands trembling as she grabbed the hospital bag she'd prepared a month earlier. On the way to the hospital, Olivia clung to her friend's hand, each contraction stealing her breath. But amid the searing pain, one thing stood clear. This wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Northwestern Memorial Hospital, 3:47 p.m. The baby boy's first cry pierced the sterile white room while the city still slept. It wasn't loud or prolonged, but it was enough to awaken a part of Olivia's heart she'd thought frozen forever. The doctor placed him in her arms, tiny, wrinkled, so fragile she hardly dared breathe, but when his minuscule hands grasped her finger, Olivia sobbed, not from pain, but from wonder, because her son, Daniel, had come into the world like a quiet miracle. The early days of motherhood bore no resemblance to the articles Olivia had read or the movies she'd seen. There were no soothing lullabies, no blissful smiles in golden sunlight, only sleepless nights by the crib, dark circles under her eyes, milk-stained shirts, and worry etched into every trembling finger. But each time Daniel opened his eyes, gazing at her with deep blue ones, the only trait he'd inherited from James, her heart softened. Not because of memories, but because of life. Daniel didn't know who his father was, and he didn't need to. In his small world, there was only his mother, and she was everything. When Daniel turned 3, he began scribbling with crayons, drawing jagged pictures. Always a little house with a yellow window and a garish blue sky. When Olivia asked, "Where's this, sweetie?" he'd reply, "It's our house, with you and me and Aunt Rachel." He didn't know his mother had once lived in a far grander place but had never felt at home. Olivia never spoke ill of James. When Daniel was old enough to ask, she gave a simple answer. "Your father was someone who wasn't ready to be a dad, but you were never a mistake." Daniel didn't press further, maybe because, deep down, he understood. Or maybe because, to him, his mother's love was enough. When Daniel started first grade, Olivia had completed her medical transcription course and landed a job at a pediatric clinic in Lincoln Park. It wasn't her dream job, but it was steady, with a livable wage and colleagues who didn't judge. Mornings, she walked him to school. Afternoons, they strolled home together, sometimes stopping for ice cream, sometimes pausing by the lake to watch ducks swim. In winter, they held hands through snowdrifts, Daniel's tiny footprints trailing behind her shoes, like the way he followed her through life, unaware of the chasms they'd crossed to get here. When Daniel turned 10, he asked her, "Mom, are you sad you had to raise me alone?" The question stopped her cold, the towel she was folding slipping to the floor. Olivia sat beside him, looking into those familiar eyes. "No," she said after a pause, "because if I hadn't been alone, I wouldn't have known how strong I could be, and if I weren't strong, I wouldn't have you." Daniel smiled and hugged her. He didn't say more. But that embrace was his answer. He understood. 10 years later, that boy would grow into a young man the world would look up to. But Olivia didn't know that then. All she knew was that, in that moment, in their cramped 2-room apartment filled with laughter, she'd found something many spend a lifetime chasing. A reason to believe she'd been right, not to give up. New York buzzed with the same fervor as it had when Olivia first arrived, but this time it was Daniel, her son, walking through the throng, carrying a silence heavier than any sound the city had ever produced. He stood before a gleaming skyscraper, its silver lettering shimmering. Crawford Enterprises. The building loomed like a colossal machine, swallowing anything not cold enough to survive. Daniel tilted his head up, his deep blue eyes, a trait Olivia had always tried not to let pain her when she saw them on his face, fixed on the structure. He stepped into the lobby. Polished marble gleamed beneath his feet as people in expensive suits brushed past. He stood out, simple shirt, worn-out shoes, a heart pounding to an unsteady rhythm. His hand tightened around a briefcase that held not job applications like the others, but a name never acknowledged. At the reception desk he spoke, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "Excuse me, I need to see Mr. James Crawford." The receptionist looked up, her professional gaze scanning his face before asking, "Do you have an appointment?" Daniel shook his head. "No, but I think he'll want to see me." She frowned. "Then I'll need a reason." Daniel hesitated for a beat, then, as if letting go of a piece of his life, he said softly but firmly, "I'm his son." Silence. The receptionist stared at him, blinking once, not out of belief, but surprise. "Your name?" "Daniel Carter." She jotted it down and disappeared behind a frosted glass door. Daniel stayed put, hands in his pockets, trying to keep his breathing even, though his mind was a tangle of chaos. What if he refuses to see me? What if he looks me in the eye and says, "I don't know who you are"? What if this life, all the pain my mother endured, is worth no more than a shrug? 5 minutes? 10? Then a man in a black suit emerged, not James, but a bodyguard. "Mr. Crawford will see you this way." Daniel swallowed hard and followed. Endless corridors led him to a tall wooden door. The man pushed it open. Daniel stepped inside. The office was vast and cold. A glass wall behind James framed Manhattan's skyline. James sat with his back to the door, the afternoon light casting a long streak across the floor, brushing his silver-streaked hair. Daniel stood still. James turned. Their eyes met. For the first time, Daniel saw a man lauded in newspapers, featured in powerful interviews, but up close he was no icon, just a person, a father who'd chosen not to be one. James rose slowly, not approaching, his gaze probing. "You are?" "Daniel," he replied, his voice roughening. "Daniel Carter, your son." A sudden silence dropped into the room like a tangible thing. James didn't react. He only furrowed his brow, his eyes no longer as sharp as in magazine photos, yet far from warm. "I don't have a son," he said lightly, as if answering a clerical question. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, unable to hide the sting. "Then who threw my mother out with a check and me in her womb? Who chose to vanish for 20 years? James stepped toward his desk, pouring a glass of water. His hand trembled slightly. "Olivia," he murmured, saying her name for the first time. "She never came to me." "Because she didn't want you to think she needed anything from you," Daniel shot back. "Because she had self-respect." James looked up, studied his son's face. Something in his eyes cracked. "Why are you here?" he asked. Daniel met his gaze, unblinking. "Because I needed to look into your eyes and be sure I'm not forgetting someone worth remembering." A deep breath. And to ask, "Have you ever regretted it?" James didn't answer. He just stood there, silent. Sometimes the truth doesn't need words. After that meeting in the office, Daniel thought he wouldn't return. He had said everything that needed saying. He had seen with his own eyes the man who abandoned his mother without a backward glance. He had heard, "I don't have a son," spoken like a dull blade scraping across memory. And that should have been enough. Or so it seemed, but 2 days later, as he stood waiting for the subway in the gray afternoon rain, an unknown number flashed on his phone. He almost didn't answer, yet a quiet instinct whispered, and he pressed the button. A stranger's voice, low and dry. "Sorry, this is a nurse from Mount Sinai Hospital. Mr. James Crawford wants to see you. He's an inpatient. Terminal cancer." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He said if Daniel Carter doesn't come, he'll die with his eyes open. Daniel stood outside the hospital room. His hand rested on the cold metal doorknob. Nearly a week had passed since they last faced each other, when James had looked at his son like a stranger, and Daniel had walked away with an ocean in his eyes he couldn't release. He pushed the door open. James lay on his side in the bed, his skin pale, his face gaunt. No trace remained of the real estate titan once pursued by the world. Just a man, old, small, and alone. "Daniel?" His voice was faint but steady. Daniel pulled a chair over and sat. No greeting, no accusations. He just looked, weighing whether this man deserved even a final sliver of trust. "You came," James gave a slight nod. "Thank you." Silence stretched between them. Only the drip of the IV and the ticking clock marked the shrinking time. "I don't expect you to forgive me," James began, his eyes fixed on the stark white ceiling. "I just need to say it once, before it all ends." Daniel's hands tightened, but he didn't stop him, and so James spoke. He talked about years consumed by ambition, fame, society's gaze, and the expectations of a controlling mother. About the fear of losing control when he learned Olivia was pregnant. About that winter night when he wrote a check and slammed the door on the only person who had ever truly loved him. "I thought I was protecting this empire, but I destroyed my family before it could even take shape." Daniel stayed silent. "For 20 years I tried to convince myself. I didn't need to know who you were," James went on, his voice hoarse like wind striking glass. "But you were there. In every child I couldn't connect with, in every recurring dream of a woman standing in the snow with eyes silent with pain." James turned to him. His eyes were red, not from tears, but because time no longer allowed for anything more. "If I could go back, I'd keep her here. I'd learn to be a father. I'd choose differently." For the first time, Daniel saw him tremble, not from illness, but from raw exposure. A once proud father, now peeling away every mask to reveal the man beneath, exhausted, remorseful, and awaiting judgment. "I don't need you to go back," Daniel said, his voice eerily calm. "I just need you to admit you were wrong." James nodded, very slowly. Then he pulled an envelope from the bedside drawer. Olivia's familiar handwriting scrawled across it. "She wrote to me, but never sent it. Rachel mailed it to me after she learned I was sick." Daniel took it, his eyes wavering. "Do you want to read it?" James asked. Daniel shook his head. "I don't need to know what she wrote. I know she lived kindly, strongly, and loved me enough not to let hate become her legacy." James's eyes welled up. His lips quivered. Can you forgive me?" Daniel looked at him for a long time. Then he reached out, for the first and perhaps last time, placing his hand on the back of the one that had given him life. Then denied it. He didn't say, "I forgive you," but that touch was enough to answer, not because James deserved it, but because Daniel needed to let go.